The reading this morning is from the 8th chapter of Mark, verses 27 through 38. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan! For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to be my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The word of the Lord. Because I only use one set of readings, one reading for each of these reflections on the Sunday morning, you won't have the chance to hear that wonderful Psalm 19, which ends with one of my favorite verses. "Let the words of my mouth, the meditations of my heart be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer." I used to pray it right just that way before sermons until I heard about a young adult who hadn't been to church and attended church and heard the pastor say that and wondered if perhaps there were times when the pastor didn't have acceptable words or meditations. And I thought, well, just in case that happens, I better say it in the plural. So now that's what I do say, because I know we all have to be careful. What are the words of our mouths, the meditations of our hearts? Today we heard some unacceptable words come out of the mouth of Peter. Well, they're unacceptable to Jesus, at least. Peter and the other disciples were on the way with Jesus, on the way to Jerusalem, a journey that would not end well. On the way is a frequent term in Mark. Perhaps he saw it as a metaphor for his own community that was on the way with Jesus. And on the way, Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do people say me to be?" And some said one thing and some said another. But then Jesus pointedly asked, "But who do you say that I am?" And at that point, Peter nails it. "You are the Messiah," he says. In Matthew's gospel, Peter is commended for that answer, but in Mark's gospel, he's told to be quiet. That messianic secrecy is one of the paradoxes of Mark's gospel. Jesus then goes on to describe a Messiah that is very different from what everybody's expecting. This Messiah will not be a military leader. He will not restore the earthly kingdom of Israel. Instead, he will suffer at the hands of the religious authorities and be put to death. In 3 days he will rise again, which really didn't make any sense to them at the time. And all of this is far too much for Peter, so Peter pulls Jesus aside and rebukes him. And in turn, Jesus turns and rebukes Peter with those unforgettable words, "Get behind me, Satan." In Mark's telling of this, there's a small detail that always jumps out at me after I get over the effect of Jesus' words. And that small detail is that before Jesus rebukes Peter, he turns and sees his disciples. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus only turns and sees Peter, and Luke omits the entire rebuke, as though it's not something that he wants to include in his story. But why does Mark include that small detail? Well, it helps to think about what the passage is doing, not just saying. Jesus is making it abundantly clear that following him will mean suffering, suffering that could lead to death. He will lead the way of that suffering, but anyone who expects to escape suffering will find that that person cannot be Jesus' follower. Those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for the sake of Jesus and the gospel will actually save it. Those who are ashamed of him will find that Jesus is ashamed of them. Jesus is confronting the very real possibility that once he is gone, his followers may choose to ease up and follow the ways of the world, the ways of the sinful and adulterous generation, the world that Mark describes. For Mark, such a route means spiritual death. He wants to be sure that all of the disciples, including his own community, then perhaps the Christians today, all of us, hear that rebuke of Jesus. To deny the possibility of suffering is to follow Satan. Those are harsh words for us. But if we remember that in the background of Mark's account of Jesus' conflict with the religious authorities is the cosmic conflict between good and evil, between God and Satan, then it makes more sense. Mark was writing for a persecuted community. Our experience today is quite different, but I'm not sure that the cosmic background has really changed that much. We're just a lot more oblivious to it. There's still an ongoing struggle between good and evil. We're just more likely to attribute evil to human actions and seek human solutions. But we would do well to listen to the rebuke of Jesus and consider well whether we have our minds set on earthly things rather than on heavenly or divine things. And that brings me back to Psalm 19, because that psalm is a glorious psalm praising God's good creation. I mean, it starts with the heavens declare the glory of God, and then turns to equal praise of God's divine law. The psalmist knows that he can't live up to that law, that he fails to do what God desires, and asks to be protected from presumptuous sins. And that's why the psalm ends with that verse that almost asks for protection as well, a verse that can help us set our minds on divine things, a verse that's well to think about throughout this coming week. Let the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.